In my judgment, issues of morality are the most difficult in philosophy. They're intellectually challenged, as everything about the human condition is relevant to them. And they're emotionally gripping because our highest values are always at stake. So it makes sense that religious philosophies often will make morality at the center of their appeal. And it makes sense that disagreements about religion can easily become tense and even emotionally overwrought. Now, our question in this episode is whether morality is natural or whether it can be explained only by reference to a supernatural being that issues moral rules and enforces them. Each of us as individuals, as moral agents, we decide what our core values are and how we will act to accomplish them. And in selecting the content of our value beliefs and deciding our methods of action, we almost always confront at some point this complex question: should I choose my morality religiously? And by that I mean either by seeking direct communication from the gods or some god, or by accepting an established religious system's moral code, or should I choose naturalistically? That is to say, by looking at naturalistic sources, that, for example, by looking at my society and going by whatever the prevailing norms in my society seem to be, right? Or by deciding independently for myself what I judge to be good or bad. Now, this can be an empirical question in part. Social science data can bear upon that question. So one thing we can do is point to many historical examples of virtuous atheists and virtuous theists, or we can look at viceful theists and viceful atheists and try to get a sense for whether historically more belong in one category or the other. And so we can work those collecting those data points into kind of useful statistics. But there are other more contemporary statistics that we can appeal to, and there's a lot of good social science data out there. So we can look at national crime statistics, for example. So who ends up in jail more often? People who are believers religiously with the religious morality, or atheists who are not basing their beliefs and actions on the basis of some religious belief system. So who ends up more in jail? Or we can look internationally. Are crime rates lower in more secular nations or in more religious nations? So we can look at the surveys that say what countries are more or less religious, and there's lots of good ones out there, and they'll ask questions like, to what extent, of millions of people, to what extent is religion important in your life? And then people will give varying degrees. But on the basis of that, we can compare otherwise similar cultural and geographical nations. So we can compare, for example, the United States with Canada. So the United States, according to the statistics, about twice as many people say that religion is very important or significant in their lives compared with Canada. And then we can compare those statistical results with the crime rates. Or we can compare more religious nations like Brazil with less religious nations like Uruguay, to take some South American examples. Or we can compare Middle Eastern examples. Turkey is about twice as religious on average as Israel is. Spain self-reports as being about twice as religious as France does. In both cases, all these countries I've mentioned, geographical proximity, the religious nations are about twice as religious as the secular nations. So what would those statistics indicate? Or we can look at the psychological data, lots of good data collecting on people who are depressed. And we can ask the question, are atheists or theists more likely to be psychologically depressed? And then in general, there's also some good statistics being collected on life satisfaction, happiness, flourishing, right, and so forth. And so we can look at those who self-report to be more naturalistic in their outlook compared to those who are more religious in their outlook, and see who seems more likely to be putting together a happy life. Now, there is a lot of good work being done here. I think some of the statistics are still suggestive and a work in progress, but I'm a philosopher by training, so what I want us to do is focus here on the philosophical debate. If we're going to talk about the foundations of morality, this is how the argument typically goes. There's kind of two facts that both have to be true in order to get morality off the ground. One about us as subjects and one about the world we live in. So one of those facts is that human beings can make choices. If we're going to be moral agents, then we have to have agency, and that means we have to be able to make choices for which we can be held to be responsible. So that's a first fact, a fact about human subjects, that we can make choices. Then we have to be choosing for something or between things, and that some of those things are better or worse, good or bad, right or wrong. So it has to be, and this is on the object side or the reality side of the equation, that reality provides some sort of a standard by which we can distinguish the good from the bad. Now, if both of those are true, that there is a difference between good or bad somehow in the world, and human beings can choose between the better and the worse, or the good and the bad, then it follows that morality is a real phenomenon. Now, of course, determinists, and there are religious determinists and there are naturalistic determinists, they're going to deny the first premise, saying that we don't have a choice-making capacity, so we can't be moral agents. But our focus is going to be now on that second step, or that second claim. If there is such a thing as a standard or a fact about reality that grounds a distinction between the good and the bad, where in reality should we look to find such a standard? Now, the religious position then argues that, and it makes a negative point at this point, naturalism. If you look in the natural world, there's nowhere you can find any distinction between good and bad, right and wrong. There is no standard, and so naturalism cannot account for morality. And then the logic of this line of development is that therefore we have to believe in moral supernaturalism. That is to say, we have to go above, beyond, behind, underneath, or in some supernatural, superior to nature dimension to find the facts that give rise to morality. Now, it's that fourth premise that is the really controversial one. That is to say that naturalism cannot account for morality because, and I do think it's false when it's baldly stated, because among naturalists, there are many lively debates and many competing approaches. So that's the one I'm going to focus on next. I am also going to argue against the fifth premise, which is serving as an intermediate conclusion in this argument, that we have to appeal to moral supernaturalism in order to find a basis for morality. And my argument there, and this will be a little later in the podcast, is, as weak as I do think the grounding for some of the naturalist moralities is, I do think that the grounding for all of the religious moralities is even weaker. Now, I do want to make one preliminary sidebar point about labeling, since this is an issue that comes up fairly frequently when I'm reading around online and in the literature. I'm using the term naturalism here, not atheism, because atheism isn't an explanation of anything. There's no such thing as atheist morality, for example. And I say that because atheism is a very delimited concept, and all it is doing is rejecting one kind of explanation, a theistic one. So here the point is that being an atheist is like being an atheist or an gremlinist or an horoscopist. It only says that one does not believe that fairies or gremlins or horoscopes explain anything. So when we're trying to turn to the positive, what in this case does explain morality, many naturalistic theories are going to be contenders. So what we need, according to the second premise, is a fact about reality in nature that grounds a distinction between good, and bad. We need a positive account, not merely a rejection of, say, a supernaturalistic account. So with such a standard to appeal to, then we can go on to make judgments about everything else involved in human life. So let me just sketch now 3 quite different naturalistic approaches that are historically powerful, very influential, and so on. And the point is going to be that these are the ones that, if one is interested in the naturalistic side of the equation, that one would direct one's attention to and think deeply about. So, what could give rise to a distinction between good and bad in the natural world? Right? One naturalist approach says, well, what is distinctive about human beings is the power of their rationality. So there's a fundamental distinction, in fact, between living rationally and living irrationally. So as naturalists, we would say, eagles and chipmunks and salmon and other living species, each of them has a distinctive set of capacities. And to live well, that's the normative term that we're adding there. To live well, they should exercise those capacities. They need to live according to their distinctive capacities, depending on the kind of beings that they are. And so human beings, since they are distinctively rational, human beings should live by the guidance of their distinctively rational cognitive capacity. And then in very broad strokes, Aristotelians and Kantians will argue in this way. Now, a very different naturalist approach is going to base itself on a different fundamental fact, the difference between life and death. So it is a fact that there's a difference between being alive and being dead. And that distinction, the argument is, too, can ground the good and the bad. The good is that which is life-promoting. The bad is that which is death-causing or leading one in the direction of death. So on the basis of that very broad distinction, we can say nutritious foods are good. Productive activities and being committed to productiveness is a good thing. Certain kinds of political systems are going to be good. And the claim is going to then be applied in each case because, so they argued for, that all of those things, nutritious foods, productiveness, certain kinds of political systems, they enhance life. Poisonous foods, being lazy, certain other kinds of political systems lead to destruction and death. So by contrast, poisons, laziness, etc., they are bad because they undermine life. And so objectivists philosophically will argue in this broad way. But again, the claim is there's a natural fact, a distinction between living and dying, and good and bad map onto that which promotes living and that versus that which promotes dying. Now, another very different approach, still naturalistically, is going to be to say there's a distinction between pleasure and pain, right? We didn't just make it up. It's not necessarily supernatural, but this is a natural, biological, or biopsychological fact about us as organisms in our interactions with the world. So what traditional hedonists and utilitarians will argue is that this is the fundamental natural difference that provides a basic standard for morality. That which maximizes overall pleasure is the good, and that which causes overall pain is the bad. Now, my point here in this podcast is not to advocate one or the other of those naturalistic moralities, but just to note, each of those does have explanatory power. Each one is based in real, observable phenomena. Each provides a standard that can be used to make decisions in countless matters in life. And so the ultimate adequacy of any one of them or superiority of them is a matter of just ongoing debate and investigation. That then is to say the naturalist claim is fairly robust that we can say human beings are agents or they have agency, and there is a fact that grounds a distinction between good and bad. Therefore, we can get morality off the ground naturalistically. And against those three and perhaps other naturalistic contenders, we would need to then compare the adequacy of grounding morality in something like a God says so, or that is to say, the need to believe that more human beings acquire their morality by listening to a God and obeying the God's commands, right, or some sort of supernatural being. Now, against the adequacy of a supernaturalist basis, right, I want to make just 4 points in this podcast. So suppose we then say, all right, we're going to look to ground ground morality in religion. The first thing that one would confront is a choice among the many religions and their competing moral messages. And on my view, it seems very striking and interesting that religious belief is very often autobiographical. That is to say, if you survey the territory, you look at all of the religions out there, there's so many different messages and so many different practices. Some of them are peaceful, some of them are violent, and so on. And what we find is individuals, to the extent that they are thoughtful, they choose among them to put together a personal religion that reflects the morality that they already judge to be more or less good. And to the extent that that is true, that then is to say that morality for many people who are thoughtful and religious says more about who they already are and what they already have made judgments to be good and bad, as opposed to the formal religious system that is presented to them and perhaps absorbs them into it. Now, to the extent that individuals who are doing this picking and choosing among the available religions and beliefs, I do think that is a much more morally healthy than those who just kind of uncritically accept wholesale pre-existing religious packages of beliefs. For example, I do think it is morally unhealthy for of all of those advocates of the major Western religions who just kind of uncritically say, whatever is in the Bible, that's what I'm going to believe, without having read it through and thought it through independently for themselves. And the reason for that is just the obvious one. Much of the Bible, much of what you read in that text is barbaric, and it was written by a relatively barbaric set of people for other relatively barbaric people. Now, what that then means is healthier people morally among the religious are going to be those who pick and choose among the Bible or other scriptural writings. So, a very strong historical case is Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist more than a theist in my judgment, but he was famous for literally in a personal copy of the Bible, cutting out only the passages in the Bible that he approved of, and then pasting them into a separate notebook for his personal reference. So he's got his personally edited version of the Bible. These are the good parts, these are the bad parts according to me, Thomas Jefferson, exercising my best moral judgment. And I think most reasonable people do, most thoughtful people do the same thing. They do it, of course, less systematically, and you don't have to agree with all of the selections that those individuals make to respect the fact that they are religious individuals who are thinking for themselves and that they are rejecting many immoral beliefs and many immoral practices required by the religious text. And I do think that's not a complete, but that is an honorable path toward one's moral development. But what's interesting, and this is a point that needs to be noted about the picking and choosing method, what that means is that morality comes before religion. I'm going to repeat that. For those individuals who are doing the picking and choosing method, morality comes before religion. That is to say, they already have some sort of personal standard of morality. They start reading through the text and they say, I think that's good and I think that's bad. I'm not sure about this. But that is to say, they're not getting their standards of morality from the text, but rather they are reading the text in terms of their already existing personal standard of morality. And on the basis of that, they are selecting religions or aspects of religion that they independently judge to fit best with their personal standard for morality. And I think that's exactly why all of the orthodox religions condemn people from doing this. And this is going to be my second point in contrast to most of the supernaturalist approaches to religion. Every major institutional religion in the West, and most of them in the East, they urge, sometimes by means of threats, sometimes by means of bribes, heaven and hell and so forth, that you have to accept this package deal of religious beliefs that have been chosen by other people. Don't you dare think for yourself about this. Don't you dare pick and choose. And in my view, that is a profound immorality. That's a profound cognitive immorality. Morality is fundamentally about individuals making choices based on independent judgment. Any belief system that undermines that core responsibility is immoral. Right? It's about making your own choices, however guided by the facts of reality. But someone who comes along and at a fundamental level says you cannot make your own choices about this most important thing, that is to subvert morality at the foundation. Now, here I think a key example to reflect upon is the biblical story, the story of Abraham's willingness to kill his son Isaac. All of the major versions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam uphold Abraham as a moral hero for having passed God's severe test. But what was the test? What Abraham is being praised for is his willingness to kill an innocent boy without understanding why, knowing that it would cause him and his wife immense pain, knowing only that he had been ordered to do so, and deferring all responsibility to God. That's obedient faith, and in my view, that is profoundly immoral. So any religion, right, and any interpretation of the major religions that goes down that road, I think to the extent you go down that road, you are going in the direction of immorality. So in my personal discussions with advocates of institutional religion, many people will say that they're very serious about morality and getting to the foundations of things, and it's important to sort out the true and the false. I like to use the Abraham story as a test of that person's moral seriousness. And in my view, only when an individual or an institutional religion explicitly rejects the lesson of Abraham can it be considered to have redeemed itself or reformed itself or have shown itself as being really fundamentally interested in human morality. So then we can go on to discuss the religions or the person's credibility on other moral issues. Now, a third point about the supernatural or religiously based approaches to morality is this. Sometimes thoughtful theists will take the above points to heart, and they will then respond, though, in a hypothetical voice to anybody who's too agnostic or atheist in their judgment, and they will ask this hypothetical question. It says, but what if, right, there really is a God, right, and someday you find yourself in Abraham's sandals? Right? So the idea here is, suppose you've gone through your life thinking like an agnostic and disbelieving and not being sure, or you're an atheist and you just you don't have the beliefs, whatever, and then it turns out you're wrong, and suddenly you're confronted with God. And God is saying, something like, why didn't you believe in me all of these years, and so on. So with respect to the issue of grounding morality, as one religious intellectual wrote, I want to use a quote from an actual person here, quote, if God is real, then by definition, he is rightfully owed our adoration, gratitude, and love, unquote. I want to highlight the word rightfully in that formulation, because that one, I don't want to say it gets smuggled in there, but it doesn't get attended to as much as it needs to. And so that formulation, as it's often used, often glosses over what is really a deeply problematic point about the foundations of any religious morality. So suppose we take the hypothetical and we go with it. Suppose for the sake of argument that there really is a God, right? A being that is perfect in his power, knowledge, morality, and so on, or pretty close to being perfect in those dimensions. And suppose that God does reveal himself or herself, right, directly to you, and shows that he is immensely powerful and intelligent, right? So this great being suddenly appears before you, and are you really powerful or all powerful, et cetera, et cetera. So you ask him to lift an ocean liner out of the water and put it back, and he passes that test. So you say, wow, this guy's amazingly powerful, and so on. He goes, but how do I know that you're really as smart as they say that you are smart? So you ask him like some really hard math questions, and he answers all of those math questions very correctly and effortlessly. And so then he says to you, now that I have demonstrated to you great power and intelligence, you should do whatever I say. But why does that follow? It doesn't follow that what the God is telling you to do is moral. I mean, the God could be extraordinarily powerful and intelligent and evil. So if you're going to base your morality on the sayings of a God, you first need to assure yourself that the God is moral. Now, how are you going to accomplish that? And this is the deeply problematic point. Religious moralities will tell us that we humans, all by ourselves in the natural world, we are ignorant of morality, the difference between good and bad, until a God tells us, right, what morality is. But if we are ignorant of morality, then when we are confronted by this being telling us what to do, we are in no position to judge whether what that godlike being is telling us is good or bad. But on the other hand, I suppose we say we're not completely ignorant prior to God telling us what the difference is between good and bad. So that then is to say, when this godlike being comes along and says, this is what I want you to do, if we are already in a position to be able to judge for ourselves whether the God's sayings are good or if they are bad, well, then we must already know the difference between goodness and badness. And if we already know the difference between goodness and badness, then we don't need the God or the godlike being to tell us what it is. Right? We have moral autonomy. Now, I'll put a reference in the notes here, but this is a classic problem in religious ethics, typically called the divine command theory, and the paradoxes built within that. Now, my fourth point with respect to religious moralities is this one here. Religious morality, in my judgment, is very often, unfortunately, actually based on deep pessimism, and sometimes even deep cynicism about the natural world. So again, I'm going to cite an example from a contemporary theist. This is one with whom I had a published 7-part debate, and I thought it was very clear. So notice from this quotation how dark the view of the natural world is and human beings is that's being expressed here. Quote, "Here is the paradox of the human condition. Man both wants the beauty of moral perfection and knows he will never find it in this life." And I'm emphasizing that last part there. So we're a bifurcated being. On the one hand, we want moral perfection, but we know that we will never find it in this life. That then is to say, somehow, if we just look at ourselves and if we look at this world here, there is no morality, there is no moral perfection, there is no moral goodness, right, and so forth. So therefore, it has to be in some supernatural dimension. But my question is, why will we never find moral perfection in this life? I mean, is no one ever honest and honest with high stakes? Is there never justice, people doing the right thing and committing and fighting tooth and nail for the right thing? Are people never self-responsible or persevering or committed to integrity? It strikes me just as empirical matter. You look around, there's lots of honesty, lots of justice, lots of self-responsibility, lots of integrity out there. So that then is to say, we don't need to say, the whole world is corrupted and immoral, and so therefore we need to go looking to a supernatural source in order to find this standard of morality. Now, of course, your point might just be that goodness is too infrequent and that it's too fragile in the face of depravity. And here's I have another quotation from my debate partner here on this one. And this is, again, to highlight the level of pessimism and cynicism here. And he says, look, quote, "No one asked me, but given a choice, I would far rather that Odin be the high god so that I could rape and pillage to my heart's content," unquote. And he goes on to argue that the reason why we need a morality is because human beings would like to go around raping and pillaging to their heart's content. And the only reason in nature that we would not do that is if there's a supernatural enforcer who's watching us and stopping us from doing so. But notice what a dark understanding, a kind of a dark personal confession that we have from this guy here. And of course, he's generalizing it to other human beings. He's saying, he all by himself, given the kind of guy that he is, he would rather damage and destroy other people rather than create and cooperate them. But he acts morally, not because he wants to, but because he's been ordered to. And he just is, kind of blithely assuming that everybody else is just as depraved as he is. And so he's, at least in my view, willing to slander the entire rest of the human species. Now, I do think it's true that, self-loathing of that sort and cynicism about human nature can be and often is the basis for religion and religious beliefs in morality. But please note, I don't claim that all advocates of religion are in this category. And also note that this final argument, or this final point that I'm making about the argument for the foundations of morality, it is in fact first not really an argument about a religion at all, but really first it's an argument about human nature. You look at the world, you look at human beings, and then what is your assessment of them? And you pass a moral judgment about them. And then depending on the direction of that moral judgment, are you pessimistic or optimistic about human beings in the natural world? On the basis of that, you then might need to, or feel the need to go on to a supernatural source to support or buttress your conception of what morality should be about. Now here I'm reminded of Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great 19th century Russian novelist, and his response to the claim of the death of God. And it's an off-cited quote. Now, he's, I don't know if he'd read actually Nietzsche, but his contemporary Friedrich Nietzsche had claimed that God is dead. And so this idea of the death of God or the decline of religion was everywhere in the 19th century. But Dostoevsky has one of his characters reply, well, if God is dead, then everything is permitted. And the fear in this case is if there is no God keeping a close eye on each and every one of us, then the beastly will dominate within us and among us. This is a very pessimistic basis for approaches to morality, and they are very widespread in all of the major versions of religious morality. But also note that this kind of pessimism is not exclusively theistic. Many atheists will also be extraordinarily pessimistic about human nature and then try to construct a morality in response to that pessimism. So here I'm thinking of Sigmund Freud in his Civilization and its Discontent. And it's kind of interesting. In the first chapter of that book, Freud is very sarcastically almost, arguing that religion is an infantile illusion, that intellectually it's hard to take religion seriously. But he then goes on to argue in the second chapter, given the irrationality and low level of intellectual competence and the beastliness of human nature, some sort of widespread religious belief is essential. So Freud urges religious belief even though he is himself an atheist. And so just as many theists seem to need to believe in a God in order to keep themselves in line, the atheist, Dr. Freud, wanted most people to believe in a God so that the fear of God would basically keep them in line. And what this final point suggests is that really much of the religion versus naturalism debate about morality turns first on an accurate assessment of human nature. So I want next to take up such issues of human nature and their implications for another important ethics and value question, the question of the meaning of life. The quest for a meaningful life comes naturally to us. As infants, we delight in exploring the world and developing our powers, hearing, seeing, tasting, crawling, eye-hand coordination, vocalizing, social interaction with parents, siblings, family, pets, and so on. As our lives become more complicated as young children, we continue to grow in the strength of our reason. We develop emotional resiliency and more powerful bodies to meet life's challenges. Now, this natural process continues into adulthood until we are capable of embracing the adventure of life fully, with commitments to meaningful careers, romantic loves, becoming parents ourselves, experiencing the profundities of art and philosophy, traveling to exotic places, including to magnificent past cultures by means of history, and then travels to the vast reaches of the universe that are made possible by science. Along the way, though, bad things can happen to sabotage us in our making a meaningful life. Of course, one bad thing, or one category of bad things, is existential. The experience of major failure in one or more of life's important values, crushing hurts in romance, the death of loved ones, careers that crash, social humiliations, pain of disease. And all of those can overwhelm our felt sense that life has meaning. Now, another bad thing that can happen to sabotage us, though, is intellectual. And this is the acquisition of beliefs that undercut one's understanding of natural life as fulfilling in its own right. That is to say, the cognitive errors that explicitly attack natural life or that do so implicitly by setting oneself up for frustrations and failures. So in religious history and religious folklore, there's a kind of a half-serious taxonomy that divides Christians, using them as the example, into three types. There's Christmas Christians, Good Friday Christians, and Easter Monday Christians. Now, Christmas is about birth, right? Benevolence, the bounties of life. Right? Good Friday, by contrast, is about suffering, sacrifice, right? Destruction. And then Easter is about our hopes and fears about what happens upon death, rebirth, hopefully, and reincarnation, possibly. Now, that point, I think, can be applied to the many varieties of religion, Christian and other types. Some of them are more life-affirming, and they are devised to provide an intellectual and religious ritual support system for the good life here on earth. These are the so-called Christmas Christians, right, for example. Right, it's about presents and goodwill and family and love and friends and so forth. But other religions, of course, focus on renunciation and the sacrifice of this life. And their belief systems are designed to rationalize and motivate renunciation, sacrifice, suffering, and so forth. And yet other versions of religion are completely different again, because what they are emphasizing is not this life at all, but rather an afterlife, and putting all of their thoughts and focus and hopes in an afterlife. And that's the location of life's true purpose. Now, our focus is on the third type, when we're talking about the network of questions that go into the overall meaning of life question. When we think about the good life as a whole, is meaning to be found in this life in its own terms, or in a state of existence beyond this life? Now, my view is that belief in an afterlife actually serves worldly purposes. Those purposes are to motivate a certain kind of moral code, or to help people deal with the reality of one's own mortality. So my intellectual debate colleague's version of Catholicism seems to be driven by a particular moral agenda. For example, when he says, and I'll put the quotation in the notes here, quote, only if, and notice the only if life after death is real, is the sacrifice of one's life or even of one's time rational, unquote. So notice what he is saying here is the important thing is that we should be sacrificing our lives, we should be sacrificing our time. That's a moral position. But the only way to make that real, or to make to support that morality, is by having a religious intellectual system that says there is a life after death. And only if that's possible, then there's a certain moral code feasible. That then is to say, it's the moral code in the here and now that's driving the intellectual ship. C.S. Lewis, that was a Catholic example, so now I'm going to shift to a Protestant example. His version of Protestantism is a variation on this theme. Quote, I find in practice that when you are in trouble, the moment you regard it as punishment, it becomes easier to bear. If you think of this world as a place intended simply for our happiness, you find it quite intolerable. Think of it as a place of training and correction, and it's not so bad. That's from God in the Dock, also quotes again in the notes here. But notice what he is saying here is he's thinking about life in the here and now. Is it about happiness, or is it about punishment? Is it about training and correction? And so it's this certain moral vision that he wants to justify and live according to, and the way to support that moral system is by thinking in terms of there being an afterworld, an afterlife, right? and so forth. So what we have then here is certain moral concepts that are in play: sacrifice, punishment, correction. Life is not supposed to be about happiness according to this position, but there is no natural reason why you would reject happiness and embrace sacrifice and punishment. So A belief in supernatural life is necessary to motivate a moral code that already wants sacrifices and punishments in the natural world. Now, the other major naturalistic concern, of course, is about death. How does one process the very sobering knowledge that someday one will die? And a belief in an afterlife can then be motivated, although typically in two very different forms. Right? I'm going to die, but I enjoy life, and I want to believe that it will be extended. Right? Or I'm going to die, but my life has been a disaster or a disappointment, and I want another chance. Now, I don't think there's any evidence of a soul or a spirit that survives bodily death. There's no evidence of supernatural places such as, Valhalla or Hades or heaven or hell. So I do think that part of philosophy is to find a healthy way to think and feel about death without resorting to fiction. Now, Socrates, Epicurus, and other philosophers have argued that death is nothing to fear because death is final. If it's final, then you are not there to suffer or even to be aware of your death. I know that's true enough. But even so, I think our concerns about death are often about now rather than later. What we're all grappling with is the realization now that someday in the future we'll be dead and what that implies for our current values. So again, it's our current naturalistic values and morality that is leading us in the direction of finding religion perhaps as a support system or considering it as such. So for example, to make it more concrete, I love my children. And how do I live now knowing that I will leave them? Or I'm passionate about music and art and I love those things. How do I now accept that such awesomeness is going to end for me and all of the music I'm going to miss out on? Or by contrast, I realize that I cannot do over or repair the past events of my life. I've screwed up in so many ways. How do I now come to terms with my disappointments or my despair? But posing an afterlife is usually a non-answer to all of the above questions. Those are all real questions, but the positing of an afterlife doesn't really solve the problem. It only defers the problem. Suppose we were to ask, okay, what is it about the afterlife that is supposed to make it so great and or to make up for sad problems? If it's about you love children and you wish you could do your children, you wish you could do that more, or you have screwed up in various things and your life has been a disappointment, how will the afterlife solve that particular problem? So, the question then is going to be what is supposed to make the afterlife in fact good, valuable, and so on, and what is one actually doing and enjoying there that makes life meaningful, if that's where we're to find the meaning. Now, some religions will speak poetically about acquiring wings and harps and floating on clouds. But then, again, I'm reminded of Mark Twain. He pointed out, how much harp music do you actually want to listen to? Also, we don't know if there's a soul, but even supposing there is a soul that separates from the body, we know what happens to the physical body upon death, all that decomposition, right? Or if one is cremated. But even if we stick with this harp music example, you can't listen to a music without ears, and you can't listen to it without a brain, and you don't have those up in heaven if there is such a place. Now, other religions, instead of floating on clouds listening to harp music, they'll promise you 72 virgins. Again, it's kind of hard to imagine how you're going to enjoy them when you don't have the appropriate equipment anymore. Your body is buried in the desert somewhere and so on. Other religions promise immortality, right, to people who really have a hard time thinking of something worthwhile to do on the weekend. One point about Albert Camus' meditation on the myth of Sisyphus, the guy who's condemned to push a boulder up a hill repeatedly for all eternity, is to push us past this kind of vague wishing for immortality. You have to have an answer to that question. What is it that you are going to do that's going to be so thrilling and exciting and meaningful in the afterlife, and not just have kind of empty metaphors and vague wishful formulations, positing an afterlife in which human valuing somehow continues. It's often a way of just giving a verbal formulation and the semblance of an answer that actually avoids answering the question. This is where I think we need to get importantly serious, because by contrast, the natural world is actually real. And in it, great love is possible, passion is possible, beauty exists, adventure, accomplishment, all of these things are genuine, real, possible. So the real question, I think, is rather than deferring to an afterlife, is asking, how can we find meaningfulness in a finite, natural life? It first takes honesty to face the world as it is. We are human beings with a human being's needs and capacity. And we can choose to commit to the achievement of genuine values, both individually and socially. Right? That takes an honest commitment. It also takes effort. Failure is always a possibility. Yes, it will come to an end for you at some point. But the fact that life's experiences come to an end, it does not diminish their value. A sunset might last only a couple of minutes. Making love may be for an hour. Celebrating your child's birthday is only for a day. They're still real, they're still meaningful, they're still significant. And so on for all of the rest that can add up to a life fully lived for however many decades it lasts, including, and hopefully including, as you reach the end of your time, your natural lifetime, the self-reflective values and the satisfaction that comes when you reflect on what you have accomplished, and the knowledge that in some form your life will enable other people whom you think of as valuable to achieve meaning in their own lives. So mortality means only that you need to live now and not push it off into some ambiguous future out of laziness, cowardice, or indecisiveness. A life that's filled with creative work and family, friends, art, literature, science, exploration, and then, as you relax, an occasional glass of wine while you reflect upon the wonder of it all. For a human being, what could be better than that?